Devil May Cry 5 is a smash hit. About 2 weeks after the game's release, it sold 2 million copies across the PC, PS4, and Xbox One. It quickly became one of Capcom's most popular games of all time. Setting aside financial merit, the game has been positively received by fans and critics, boasting positive reviews across many sites and platforms. With all this in mind, let's break down the quality of Devil May Cry 5 with respect to its own design and how it compares to previous entries. And what better way to start than with some words of wisdom? Let's rock!
DMC is back!
Oh my god, why am I in slow motion? It's badass.
Devil May Cry 5 is the best looking game in the franchise, primarily due to the game being rendered with the RE engine. Cutscenes are without a doubt gorgeous, but the in-game animations are the most appealing aspect since combat is the focus of this franchise. Animations are visually intuitive, with each attack capable of smoothly transitioning into other actions. Imagine doing a basic combo string on an enemy, and then repeating that same string, but cancelling that string with a special attack without the combo string ending abruptly. Combo string enders can even smoothly transition into special moves, showing the attention put into the details. The world of Devil May Cry 5 is well designed, but the use of color palettes is bland compared to the previous titles. Previous games had a gothic aesthetic to them, but they've provided a variety of color palettes for different levels. In Devil May Cry 5, the color palette repeats in most levels. It's not deal-breaking considering the context of the story, but it would have been interesting to see how far the developers could have gone with designing their world. Overall, the developers have done a good job with making the game look amazing. Sure, the world design could use more work, but the character models look great, and the meat of Devil May Cry 5 is in the combat, which the animations perfectly portray. On top of that, the music also does a good job of setting the game's mood. Devil May Cry 5 uses rock music like the previous games. This time around though, a lot of them are lighter in tone. While level themes have dark and moody tones, they end up losing prominence as soon as a fight begins. When fights start, a song plays depending on the character being used. By default, Nero's theme is Devil Trigger, V's is Crimson Cloud, and Dante's is Subhuman. If the Digital Deluxe Edition was purchased, battle themes from the previous games become available for the player to use in-game. They're neat extras and they're not bad by any means. They just fall flat compared to the current themes due to how the latter are designed. The default tracks are dynamic. They play softly at the start of a fight, but become much louder the higher your style rank gets in combat. Due to how energetic, loud, and powerful these themes are by themselves, the compositions induce adrenaline in the heat of battle. As a result, The new songs end up being better to use in-game than their predecessors. This begs the question as to why the older soundtracks weren't modified to be dynamic. By modifying them to fit the game's new combat style, new and veteran players will be able to appreciate these classics, especially when they become louder as players become more stylish. Of course, boss themes also exist. Just like the character themes, they provide adrenaline to give the fights life. Unfortunately, they aren't dynamic like the character themes, which is a shame since they could probably give more adrenaline if they were. That said, Devil May Cry 5 has an amazing soundtrack. The compositions are really good at setting their moods, immersing players into the world of Devil May Cry. It's highly recommended to listen to these tracks whenever possible. This can be done by finding them on YouTube, listening to them on Spotify, purchasing the soundtrack on Steam, or continuing on with this video. Speaking of moving on, now that we've covered the visuals and compositions, let's move on to the plot, because the writing is shockingly solid for a game primarily focused on action. The game takes place in Redgrave City. Citizens are watching a demonic plant appear and grow at a rapid pace. Morrison, an associate of Dante, watches from the sidelines, hoping that the hunters are fine. This beginning is the first of its kind in the franchise. There was never any concern for the well-being of the devil hunters, especially Dante's. The series often presents these dangers as things the characters could handle. With the presence of concern, the game presents the story as Dante's most difficult journey in his life. The prologue changes to Nero entering the scene. He's accompanied by a man named V, and they're on their way to help Dante defeat a powerful demon. The prologue is simple enough. It's a mission teaching players how to use Nero's Red Queen and Blue Rose. In the previous game, Nero had access to the Devilbringer. It's a demonic arm that allowed him to grab demons from a distance to bring them closer or throw them around when they're close enough. This time though, you play through this mission without the Devilbringer, meaning he fights through the mission with just one arm. As he reaches the throne room, he finds Dante, Trish, and Lady down and defeated. Nero then takes on the demon, only to be outmatched. Throughout this fight, the demon dishes out a variety of attacks at the player. With Nero's limited moveset at the beginning of the game, it's difficult to evade these attacks and counter appropriately. It's an organic way to present the protagonist's struggles. Just as Nero was about to lose, Dante recuperates and resumes his fight with the monster. Nero tries to help, but Dante tells the pair to retreat, calling Nero dead weight in the process. V and Nero eventually retreat and now have to find a way to stop this new threat known as Urizen, the demon king responsible for taking Nero's Devilbringer. A month passes and we see Nero in an RV driven by Nico. She helps out Nero in his demon hunting business. She's also the daughter of Agnes, the mad scientist who worked for the Order of the Sword in Devil May Cry 4. The pair makes their way to Redgrave City, but they encounter demons and run them over. After dealing with them, the two continue their way to Redgrave City. As they make it to the bridge, they find that the place is littered with demons, and Nero has a clear way for them to progress. Nero gleefully does so as he starts using his new toy, the Devilbreaker. It's a prosthetic arm that can deal massive damage to enemies and have some interesting uses as well. Once the path is cleared, Nico tells Nero that they have to finish the job quickly before the tree destroys the world. Nero ponders on the day of his Devilbringer being torn out by a hooded man. Once torn, the latter summoned the demon sword Yamato that Nero had absorbed in the previous games and created a portal to leave. As a result, Nero lost all of his demonic powers that manifested. Returning to present time, the two eventually enter Redgrave City, and Nero has to find a way to meet up with V. As he explores the city, he finds a ringing telephone booth and answers it. It turns out that Nico and Nero often have a routine of meeting up by contacting each other through a telephone. Frustrated, she changes how they meet up, saying that he has to be the one to make the call. This serves as a player's first way to acquire combat moves and upgrades, and in Nero's case, acquire additional Devil Breakers to equip for a specific loadout. While it seems odd that she can't just bring Nero to where he needs to be, it's fair to assume that she only progresses until Nero clears a path since he can take out a pack of demons efficiently. It also makes equipment and supply management much easier. As Nero explores Redgrave, he encounters a demon named Goliath, and after making snarky quips to it, engages with the demon in combat. Just as Goliath is defeated, V shows up to take down Goliath and land the final blow. After the victory, V tells Nero that they must destroy the roots of the Qliphothoth tree before entering it again to prevent any more destruction to the human world. Nico then arrives with a van to pick up the two. Before continuing, she asks V to pick up the remaining parts of Goliath. She sniffs the part in excitement as she now has a demon part to use to create a brand new Devil Breaker for Nero, resulting in the birth of Punchline. And just like that, Nero can now get new breakers after completing certain missions, similar to how Dante gets new weapons since Devil May Cry 3. As V and Nero split up, Nero travels through the sewers and eventually enters a library. As players explore in-game, he briefly remarks how strength is needed to protect those you care about. It's a subtle line that establishes his motivation for wanting more power, especially for the latter parts of the story. As he enters a large section of the library, he's ambushed by a flying demon named Artemis. After weakening Artemis, he notices that there's someone inside the demon, so he slices the demon open to rescue the unconscious person. After the battle, he realizes that the person inside the demon was Lady, so Nico and Nero return to the RV to treat Lady, but not before taking a sample of Artemis's remains. Meanwhile, players take control of V during the time Nero goes through the sewers. As V begins his journey, he encounters demons, so he summons his familiars Griffin and Shadow to fight. Griffin reminds V that while they can hurt enemies, they aren't capable of killing them, meaning he has to kill them the moment they're weak. After killing them, he makes his way around the city, determined to stop Urizen. He stumbles upon Needhog, a plant-like demon that becomes aggressive after being insulted by Griffin. After killing Needhog, V and his familiars notice a gigantic demon nearby. V tries to escape knowing that he can't defeat the demon, but ends up falling into the sewers after the demon follows them and breaks the ground below them. After the fall, V tries to get back to the surface, occasionally encountering the appendages of the gigantic demon. Upon returning to the surface, he encounters an elder Garian knight that is tracking the Devil Sword Sparta. The knight flees to look for the sword upon the Garian horse's death. With his new knowledge in hand, V takes a sample of the horse to Nero and Nico. As Nico and Nero are taking care of Lady, the giant demon that is revealed to be Gilgamesh makes its way towards them. Nero steps out to fight Gilgamesh to buy time for Lady's recovery. After defeating the demon, Nico tells Nero that Lady is awake, and on top of that, she asks Nero to give her the sample of the remains so that she can make more breakers. The two ask questions regarding Trish and Dante, but Lady only remembers Trish being captured like her as well. V meets up with Nero and gives Nico the sample of the horse he killed. He tells Nero that they can't travel through the Qliphothoth with the RV, so Nero gets his things ready to travel. After regrouping, Nero and V go through the subway to enter the Qliphothoth. As they make their way to a crumbling theater, they encounter a pack of Proto-Angelos led by Skuldo Angelo. While Nero makes a quick quip, V is remarkably angry and more than willing to kill these demons. After defeating the Angelos, the pair jump off the stage just before it falls into a ravine. As they take a look at the entrance of the Qliphothoth, V remembers that Redgrave was attacked before, and that he was playing outside of his home when it happened. After that, V and Nero part ways as V starts looking for the Devil Sword Sparta, while Nero goes back to fight Urizen again. As Nero makes his way through the Qliphothoth tree, he eventually returns to the throne room to fight Urizen again. After doing some damage, Urizen rises up from his throne and becomes even more aggressive, eventually becoming too much for Nero to handle yet again. Just as Nero thought he was done for, a demon comes out of nowhere and fights Urizen. Nero though starts losing consciousness just as the battle is about to heat up. The game flashes back to May 3, and we see Morrison giving Dante a new job. Morrison introduces V to Dante, and then leaves to get Trish and Lady to join as well. As Dante and V talk about the job, V reveals to Dante who exactly the demon he's supposed to kill is. The game then flashes forward to V looking for the Devil Sword Sparta. On his way, he laments over the memories of his mother's death. Eventually, he senses that the Sparta sword is just close by, and dispatches all the demons influenced by the sword. After obtaining the sword, he and Griffin notice that Dante is just below them, and proceed to get him. V then tries to stab the former with a sword, seemingly out of anger. Just before waking up, Dante has a flashback of the time that demons invaded his home. In this game, players get to see Eva, the mother of Dante and Virgil, for the very first time. She hides Dante in the closet and tries to rescue Virgil, only to die in the process. Just as the flashback ends, Dante wakes up to find a sword near his face. V and Dante talk about the events that transpired before Nero took on Urizen the first time. After discussing the events prior, Dante wields the Devil Sword Sparta and heads out to take on Urizen again, but not before heading somewhere first. On his way though, he encounters Cavalier Angelo, the knight that was looking for the Devil Sword Sparta. The two duke it out, and just like Artemis, he notices that someone is inside the demon. He starts slicing up the demon rapidly, and as he's slicing, some of its demonic energies are being transferred to a motorcycle that was sliced in half earlier. As a result, he saved Trish, who was inside Cavalier Angelo, and acquires a new weapon named the Cavalier. After Cavalier's defeat, V catches up to Dante, but the latter leaves immediately, telling the former to take care of Trish. After Dante leaves, Trish wakes up to find V reading his book of poetry. She asks him who Urizen is, as she knows that Urizen isn't a demon. As a result, V decides to reveal Trish his origins. He talks about Virgil and how he struggled with being defeated by Dante multiple times during his time as Nero Angelo in Devil May Cry 1. After Mundus' defeat in Devil May Cry 1, Virgil takes years to free himself from Mundus' influence, becoming weakened as a result. As such, Virgil sought out the Yamato and ripped off Nero's Devilbringer since it absorbed the sword. After acquiring the Yamato, Virgil opens a portal to teleport to his family's household to make sure he isn't followed. When he reaches his home, he ends up stabbing himself to separate his humanity from his demon side. V was born as a result, acquiring black tattoos and black hair, as the familiars are also from Virgil. The other half of Virgil became Urizen, and quickly rose to power in the underworld, escalating the events that occurred in the game. This scene can be seen as somewhat absurd, as there's no apparent hint about the Yamato being capable of doing that, especially in Devil May Cry 5. Any audience could end up asking these two questions. How did Virgil know about the Yamato being able to do that specific action? And why is it only now that he decided to use it on himself? These questions could be answered with evidence in the previous games. After Nero fights Dante again in Devil May Cry 4, Dante talks about how Sparta used the Yamato to separate the demon world from the human world. If the sword can separate two worlds from each other, it can then be reasonably assumed that it's possible for Virgil to separate his demon and human parts. As to how Virgil would know that specific information, the Yamato was passed down to him from his father since his childhood, and on top of that, Virgil has studied his demonic powers and that of Yamato since the day that their home was invaded by demons. As such, he's heavily knowledgeable about his capabilities, as well as Yamato's. As to why it's only now he would do such a thing, it's simply out of desperation. A key thing to note about Virgil's personality is that he's always calm, collected, and calculating. It's true that Virgil wants to become more powerful, but that means nothing if he isn't in control. That all changed though when he was possessed by Mundus in Devil May Cry 1 and transformed into Nero Angelo. Even after regaining his free will, Mundus' influence persisted. This is supported by his voice during the cutscene in which he arrives in Nero's garage.
I'm taking this back. I'm running out of time.
There's one thing to note about V's origins. Virgil stabbed himself while facing away from the family painting. This may not mean much now, but I'll explain its relevance for the story as I continue talking about the plot, as it's rather thematic and subtle. Going back to the story, after V tells Trish his origins, he laments how as a human, he realizes what he has done wrong, and hoped that Dante would at least correct his mistake, while subtly hoping that Dante could fix his predicament. Trish eventually regains her strength, telling him that he has to at least see this through since he's part of this whole ordeal. Dante eventually finds his old home. Looking at the painting, he reflects upon what V told him about Urizen, and he ponders on the time that Virgil stabbed him with a rebellion, which opened up his demonic abilities as a result. As Dante brings out the broken rebellion, he thinks about what Virgil did with the Yamato, so he stabs himself with the rebellion, guessing that the rebellion does the opposite effect of the Yamato. As a result, he absorbs the Devil Sword Sparta and acquires a new sword, the Devil Sword Dante. On top of that, he also acquires a new mode, the Sin Devil Trigger. It's very interesting to analyze this scene because Dante stabs himself in front of the family portrait. It's a subtle way of showing how contrasting they are in their personalities and philosophies. Eva is pretty much the reason why they have their humanity. Aside from inheriting the human part of her, she was responsible for their upbringing in their childhood, essentially teaching them how to be human. Virgil looks away when he stabs himself because he wants to cast off his humanity, as he was put in a situation where he needed to be stronger to survive. He became much colder as a result, and wanted nothing more than power, and found his humanity to be in the way of that power, especially after losing to Mundus and Dante. Dante faces the portrait when he stabs himself because he wants to maintain his humanity and demonic heritage so that he can still be powerful and caring, especially since that's what got him this far in all of his years as a hunter. With this new power, he flies to Urizen's throne and fights him. As Urizen loses the fight, the throne room starts to crumble, and he takes the opportunity to escape. As Dante escapes with Nero, the two regroup with V and the women. V tells them that Urizen is most likely trying to reach the fruit of the Qliphotth since it absorbed enough blood to bear one. The three head down to go deeper into the Qliphotth tree, and begrudgingly fight together against the demons blocking their way. Eventually, the floor breaks below them, catching the three off guard and separating them. As V regains consciousness, he tries to go deeper, but is slowly losing strength to go farther. He ends up falling asleep due to demonic powers present in the room he enters. After regaining his familiars in the dream area he was trapped in, he continues further down the Qliphotth until he encounters Malphys again. Just as Malphys is about to attack V, Nero shoots at Malphys, challenging her to a fight. He defeats her, and V begs for Nero to assist him in confronting Urizen. Nero reluctantly helps V, complaining how Dante will reach Urizen first before they can. Dante meanwhile reaches the bottom to where the Qliphotth fruit is, but the hole is guarded by King Cerberus. Out of nostalgia, he taunts the monster by treating him like a pet. A fight ensues, and after a tough battle with it, the beast becomes a devil arm, allowing Dante to fight with fire, ice, and electricity. As Dante finds Urizen, Urizen consumes the Qliphotth fruit, obtaining all the power he ever wanted. Urizen and Dante fight one last time. As Dante weakens Urizen, the latter asks how Dante is able to become strong, in which the hunter responds with strength being a choice and the will to fight to protect what is important. As Dante and Urizen are fighting, V reveals to Nero his origins. Nero questions why it's necessary for them to fight, with V answering that it's the only way they know how to settle their differences. As Dante defeats Urizen, Nero and V arrive at the scene. Just as Dante is about to land the final blow, V requests that he be the one to kill Urizen. Just as V stabs Urizen in the chest, the two end up fusing, resulting in the return of Virgil. Dante and Virgil briefly fight, but Virgil tells Dante to recover first before they fight each other at the top of the Qliphotth so they can settle their differences once and for all. This scene does come off as somewhat of a stretch, as it seems weird that stabbing Urizen would lead to V and Urizen becoming whole, since it is proven throughout V's gameplay that his sword kills demons. There is, however, the fact that the Qliphotth fruit has the ability to alter reality, and probably affected how the blade would normally react as a defense mechanism. There are also questions as to whether V planned this event or not. It wouldn't be much of a surprise to believe that V would want to fuse the Urizen in order to live, but it's hard to imagine V having much confidence in being able to pull that off, considering the result of the last encounter. This then begs the question of whether V was aware of the full power of the fruit or not, as V does have quite the knowledge regarding phenomena in the underworld. It goes along with V's enigmatic trait, but it does question if this writing was intentional or not. Moving on, after Virgil leaves, Nero insists on coming along with Dante to stop Virgil. Dante refuses Nero's aid, but the latter pushes the topic, insisting that he's not weak. Out of frustration, Dante blurts out that Virgil is Nero's father. Nero is shocked by this, but Dante expands on his reasoning. While the Yamato can be wielded by a son of Sparta, the Yamato has a stronger reaction to Virgil considering that he's been using it for years. The fact that Nero was even able to acquire Devil Trigger with the Yamato proves that he's related to Virgil. Dante explains that he doesn't want Nero to be in a position where the former has to kill his father. Dante leaves while Nero is still trying to absorb the information. As Dante climbs the tree, V's familiars confront Dante. They reveal that they were the manifestation of Virgil's nightmares when he was possessed as Nero Angelo and only came to life when Virgil stabbed himself. Now that Virgil is whole and they're not controlled by V anymore, they're free to do whatever they want, and their first course of action is to kill Dante. An interesting thing to note here is that the three familiars, Griffin, Shadow, and Nightmare, are actually named after the enemies that Dante had fought in DMC1. It's not exactly a subtle reference for the more hardcore fans of the series, as even the attacks of the familiars are similar to the ones that the bosses used. It's very interesting nonetheless to see how they integrate these references to the story. After Dante defeats the trio, Griffin reminds him that he'll have a much harder time facing Virgil compared to them. After that warning, Griffin fades away, happy that Virgil has no more nightmares since they're separated from him and dying. While Griffin isn't the easiest character to be around considering how snarky he is, he ends up becoming entertaining with the humor involving him being the butt of the jokes. Basic storytelling often adds lighthearted moments to temporarily contrast the main tone of a story, offering something to the audience to care about the characters. When a twist about that character occurs, it can cause quite a shock to the audience thanks to those lighter moments. It also doesn't help that familiars fight for you in combat. One of the biggest advantages of video games is through their interactivity, it is possible to design mechanics in a way that players can form an emotional attachment to characters in a video game. When playing V, not only do players have to find ways of dealing damage with the familiars, but they also have to find a way to sustain their familiars' health to make sure they aren't stalemated. When they're stalemated, V has no means of killing his foes since nothing is weakening them. The idea does become ironic considering the context, but it does provide a unique perspective in how struggles can be used to improve a person. Dante eventually reaches the top and confronts Virgil. One thing to note is that Virgil is a lot more laid back this time around, especially compared to DMC3, more than likely due to the additional memories he has from V. That said, he's still prideful and wants to prove that his way is right by fighting Dante. Dante obliges, mentioning that it's always been something they've been doing. During the battle, Virgil realizes that Nero is his son, and remembers when he was in Fortuna during the time of his campaign in the special edition of DMC4. He doesn't reflect much on it as Dante and Virgil are about to finish their fight. Much to their surprise, a demon jumps in the middle of their clash and stops both of them. This fight can make audiences ask one question: how and why did Virgil find Nero without knowing his existence? Throughout the story, it is heavily implied that the characters can sense demonic energies. It can then be assumed that Virgil was specifically looking for the Yamato at that time. Since Nero absorbed the Yamato, it would make sense that Virgil would find Nero. It just shows how much thought was put into the story in order for everything to make sense. While Dante and Virgil were fighting, Nero returns to the RV, frustrated with everything that's happening. Lady warns Nero that he doesn't want to be in a position where he has to kill his father, remembering what she went through in DMC3. Nero gets out of the RV to stop Dante and Virgil, and while climbing to the top, he finds a phone booth and calls Kyrie. He talks about growing up as an orphan and only having a family with Credo and Kyrie, and is struggling with knowing he has a family and how to deal with it. Kyrie supports him by saying that he always knew what to do, and that he should never doubt himself. Now confident, Nero promises her that he'll return home soon. Just as he reaches the top, he remembers Credo's death in DMC4, and how he wished he could have saved Credo. This further solidifies the reason for his desire to become strong. He always wanted to be able to protect those he cared about, and now that he realizes that Virgil is his father, he becomes motivated to stop the sibling rivalry so that his father and uncle can live. As a result, his Devil Breaker breaks, and a new arm grows out of it. On top of that, he unleashes his powers and activates his Devil Trigger, and interfering with Dante and Virgil's fight. Dante is shocked by Nero's sudden strength, and decides to back down from the fight. Virgil is still stubborn though, and challenges Nero to a fight, promising that he'll listen to Nero's commands provided the latter beats him. The fight is intense not just because of the challenge that Virgil provides, but because of the exchange that occurs throughout the fight as well. As mentioned earlier, Virgil is too stubborn to admit that he is wrong, and often gives a cold demeanor when he talks. Nero, on the other hand, is impatient with Virgil, as the latter doesn't seem to understand the gravitas of them being family.
Of your existence.
Despite that, Nero eventually beats Virgil. Even after defeat, Virgil persists that he can still fight, but refrains from doing so as he points out that the Qlipoth tree is about to destroy the world, and the only way to stop it is to cut off the root in the underworld. Virgil gets ready to leave, and Dante joins up so that he can help him destroy the root as well as settle the rivalry they have after saving the world. Nero resents this idea since that means that the two won't be able to return to the human world. Dante and Virgil continue on to the underworld regardless, giving Nero responsibility of protecting humanity from demons. Dante dives first into the underworld, followed by Virgil, but not before the latter gives V's book of poetry to Nero as a reminder that they will fight again one day. After the events that transpired, Nero and Nico head home. The artisan is intrigued by the sudden growth of Nero's arm, and is somewhat annoyed at the idea of his arm being back considering the work she put into the Devil Breakers. She also notices that Nero is depressed over Virgil and Dante's departure. She tells him that he's allowed to cry, at the cost of being teased. He retorts that he won't cry, and she responds that devils can cry, leading them into an argument of whether or not devils can cry. As they bicker, Kyrie calls them to check up on Nero. Meanwhile, Nico teases Nero while he's talking to Kyrie. The call is short-lived though, as demons block their way. Nero steps out to face them, but Nico reminds him to use the Devil Breaker, encouraging him by saying that her breakers are only masterpieces because of him. The Devil Breaker fuses with his newly grown arm, and he begins to take on the demons. Once Nero hastily defeats the demons, the last root of the Clyphoth tree disappears, implying that the brothers have succeeded. In the underworld, Virgil and Dante make their way to the root of the Clyphoth tree. They're eager to destroy it so they can settle their rivalry once and for all, but demons block their way, forcing them to fight. After quickly dispatching the demons, the brothers quickly make their way to the root. Weeks after the incident, Trish and Lady talk about who gets to take over Dante's shop, but Morrison walks in, showing that he has rights to the deed. Quickly after that, he gives Trish and Lady an assignment to do immediately since they now work under him for the Devil May Cry establishment. In the underworld, Dante and Virgil fight. After Dante gains the upper hand, he brags that he has more wins, but Virgil reminds him that they're evenly scored. The brothers take a break and ponder how long their rivalry will last, with Virgil insisting that it's fine since they have more than enough time to settle it. As they resume their fight, demons show up, making the brothers stop their duel and take down the interfering demons. The story properly ends with Virgil warning Dante not to say his favorite phrase, only for Dante to say jackpot and shoot the pistols. Devil May Cry 5's story is shockingly well written. The writing is highly commendable because it's able to use the lore and story of previous games and combine these elements to make a cohesive story. This is especially noticeable in significant plot points of the campaign. All the nods and references to the previous games are explained competently in the story to make them feel natural. All the emotional moments in the story are earned with the appropriate context, and this is why this section is one of the longest parts of the video. But now that the story is done, it's time to move on to the gameplay, especially since there is a lot to cover. Devil May Cry 5's campaign consists of 21 missions, and players can choose to play in one of two difficulties. Human mode being the easiest difficulty, and Devil Hunter mode being the game's normal difficulty. Human mode reduces the health of enemies and the damage they can deal in the game. As a result, mission scores and ranks are recorded separately per difficulty. A huge change to DMC5's gameplay is that recovery items are not in this game, and only gold orbs, blue orbs, and purple orbs are purchasable in-game. In the previous games, players could purchase Vitality Stars to regain health, or Devil Stars to regain Devil Trigger, and even gold orbs to revive after just dying in a fight to immediately continue. This makes players improve in their capabilities since they have less chances for second wins, as well as making sure that the action doesn't stop abruptly. After fighting enemies, players are rewarded stylish points depending on how well they fought. These scores are recorded throughout a mission, and when a mission is cleared, the stylish points are averaged to make a base score of the mission. Bonuses are applied based on the actions players perform throughout the mission. The higher the rank, the greater the amount of red orbs are rewarded. Red orbs can also be acquired as missions are explored and serve as the game's currency to unlock new moves, upgrades for unlocked moves, and items that increase survivability. On the topic of upgrades, let's discuss a bit some general upgrades available. Speed Up is a general upgrade which, as the name implies, makes characters run faster, but only starts after moving for a few seconds. It's a nice quality of life to move from one part of a mission to another, but it's hard to control at the beginning because characters slide first before stopping due to inertia. Because of this, movement comes off as clunky in early playthroughs when the upgrade is unlocked. Air Hike, on the other hand, is a great upgrade. Jumping in Devil May Cry is good not just because it allows you to reach elevated platforms or reach enemies, but because it is the game's dodge button in the loosest sense. While characters can dodge by locking onto an enemy and pressing the jump button while tilting the joystick, there are times when jumping is much more efficient since jumping is faster than dodging and players can move as they land. This is especially important to consider since jumping makes characters invulnerable until the peak of the jump. Characters can even cancel their attacks by simply jumping, offering ways for players to keep themselves safe from any retaliation. Air Hike allows characters to jump one more time while mid-air, increasing the distance and height covered. On top of that, when properly timed, players can extend the invulnerability frames of a character, ensuring that they're safe from danger. Another useful feature of Air Hike is that it also gives players the ability to essentially dodge mid-air, ensuring safety even while on the offensive. Enemy Step is another ability worth mentioning, which allows characters to jump on enemies. Just like Air Hike, it opens up options to evade attacks. An interesting thing to note though about Enemy Step is that this can be used on enemies in the air, even if characters are at the same height as their foes. What this essentially means is that players can cancel basic air combos and air attacks by jumping towards foes, so characters have more access to new combos not normally possible. Majority of these upgrades, especially the last two examples, have prices that make sense. Speed Up only affects run speed, so it's about 8,000 red orbs. Air Hike provides a great amount of utility, so it's at least 40,000 red orbs. Enemy Step improves offensive capabilities by a mile, so it's also at least 40,000 red orbs. That said, there's only one ability that has a fairly questionable price, and that's EX Provocation, as it costs 3 million red orbs. In the game's defense, it's a taunt that isn't necessary for combat, and the necessary upgrades are easily available, especially when the game is generous with the red orbs it gives. An auto mode is available in Human and Devil Hunter difficulties. By enabling this mode, players can perform advanced moves with the press of a button. Using auto mode is ill-advised though, because this doesn't teach players how to play the game. It can even negatively affect a player's experience, be it steepening the learning curve for no reason since it's not available in the higher difficulties, removing precision and control since it performs random moves, or giving players an inaccurate experience of the game. A great example of the last one was when Downward Thrust uploaded his review of Devil May Cry 5. He played the game in auto mode, and as a result, he didn't properly understand the mechanics of the game and claimed the game to be about button mashing, infuriating his audience as a result.
But like most games, it also has flaws. There's too many interruptions, the gameplay is often extremely button mashy and sometimes repetitive, the level design for the most part is predictable and uninspired, and the game is quite short. But outside of those qualms, I definitely enjoyed my time with it from a moment-to-moment basis. Devil May Cry 5 will cost you $60 at launch, and it ran me a total playtime of about 12 to 13 hours. You can extend that length by about 5 hours if you search out secret missions, but in terms of replayability, there's not too much here.
The video is currently unavailable on his channel, apparently due to someone filing a false copyright strike on it. It's hard to determine if his video was taken down or if it was deleted, as he never actually provides any screenshots of any emails regarding the strike. Until then, it's safe to assume that it's gone due to backlash. Links will be left in the description below for people to download the video in its entirety and watch the hosts of Every Frame a Pause, or EFAP, break down the review and how it's terrible.
The game this past week, and this is my review.
Hold on, before we go on further, I've never played Devil May Cry, so I know nothing about it. What is auto mode?
Alright, so in Devil May Cry, there are two difficulties. There's the human mode, there's the Devil Hunter. Now, you can have an assist mode where you can just basically press one button and it will do the combos for you, whereas in the game, normally you have to pull off a combination of buttons to do itself. So assist mode is basically just one button press.
So, hold on, it's literally just
Easy
taking
mode.
the combos and making it, oh, you don't have to do the combos, the game just does it for you. That's retarded.
As a lot of people refer to it as journalist mode.
Wonderful.
So, yeah, it might change your experience.
Auto mode also reduces a mission's total score by 20%, practically telling players to learn the game. It's also quite odd that auto mode even exists. The tutorials and tooltips in Devil May Cry 5 are comprehensive, and players can still go back to read them in the main menu. On top of that, players have access to a skill list to remember what techniques are at their disposal. All of these options make the game highly accessible, making auto mode a useless feature that shouldn't have been added to the game. Auto mode is especially annoying for players who don't enable it, because the game assigns the right stick button to enable and disable auto mode in Human and Devil Hunter difficulties. What happens as a result is that the right stick button can't be used for its default function, resetting the camera. If the developers wanted to persist having auto mode, then it would be much better to at least remove the ability to enable and disable auto mode via in-game inputs so that players don't accidentally enable it. While players can unlock a harder difficulty by clearing the game in either Human or Devil Hunter mode, it's heavily recommended to play the game in Devil Hunter mode as it offers a challenge to newcomers while still being relatively easy, especially when players start off with a limited moveset. Sons of Sparta, or SOS for short, increases the health of enemies and the damage they deal. Players also end up fighting more enemies in this difficulty, including the demons that don't appear in earlier missions. That said, SOS should be manageable since a majority of a character's move kit can be unlocked by completing the game once. Finishing the game in SOS unlocks the next difficulty, Dante Must Die. Dante Must Die, or DMD for short, in addition to the increase in health of enemies and damage they have, also gives enemies Devil Trigger, a power-up mode that is usually available to the playable characters. More enemies are also added in mission areas, which, combined with the additional buffs that enemies receive, require players to know how to defeat demons efficiently lest they lose repeatedly. Finishing the game in DMD unlocks 2 more difficulties, Heaven or Hell mode and Hell in Hell mode. Heaven or Hell mode, or HOH for short, makes enemies and players killable with one hit. The mode focuses more on efficiency than style, and can easily reward players with S ranks in missions since players can just use range attacks to kill foes. With this in mind, majority of the achievements in the game exclude this mode to ensure that players earn these achievements with effort. Hell and Hell mode, or HAH for short, is a combination of HOH and SOS. Enemies can kill players in one shot, but players have to deal the same amount of damage that they often deal to enemies in SOS mode to kill them. This difficulty is not for the faint of heart, and requires players to understand and properly use all the defensive measures available to them in order to survive. All of these difficulties help in creating the replayability of Devil May Cry 5. Whether it's finishing the game in all difficulties, or even getting S ranks in all missions in all difficulties, the game clearly shows the limits of its replayability, but it does more than enough to provide both engaging combat, which will be discussed later on, and engaging challenges to make the game worth playing. Devil May Cry 5 also introduces a cameo system. Throughout the game's story, missions of one character end up intersecting with missions of other characters due to the chronological placement, allowing players to see how others clear their missions. In missions 7 and 13, it's even possible to play with other players. When missions with cameos are cleared, the player must evaluate if other players have done well. Players who are rated as stylish get gold orbs as a reward. The developers intended this system to pressure players into performing well, but it doesn't do that well as players are often focused in the levels that they're in, and often just makes players feel generous by just saying that the others are stylish so that they can give the others gold orbs. The levels are much more linear and simpler compared to previous entries. There's still some exploring to be done to find extra items to make you stronger, but you don't have to solve much puzzles compared to the previous games. Regardless, most of the extra goodies are hidden by character mechanics that are available even at the start of the game. Nero, for example, can sometimes shoot orbs in the sky that ignite with blue flames when shot, making them usable with his Devil Breaker to reach different areas. V can sometimes destroy environments by using his Devil Trigger mode, opening up areas that he couldn't explore by other means. This is most likely due to the game being heavily focused on combat and how they can make 3 characters engaging and unique when fighting. Up to 12 secret missions are scattered throughout the game. The missions start out simple, but become more complex as players find more of these missions. Some missions have players trying to finish a goal without touching the ground. Other missions do not allow being hit by enemies. Others have time limits. Regardless of the mission, they offer rewards to make characters stronger, and are a great way to shake up the game from time to time. Combat, though, is what ultimately defines the franchise. Aside from basic movements like running and jumping, each character has a basic melee attack and ranged attack. They can be chained together to do different combos. Different combos can be used if certain attacks are delayed in a string, while some attacks can be charged to become even more powerful. There are also certain attacks that can be performed by locking onto an enemy and simultaneously tilting the left analog stick to a certain direction and pressing an attack button. This is important to note because during combat, a style rank appears when damage is dealt to enemies and decreases when different attacks are performed one after another, as well as dealing more damage to enemies. Take note that the same attacks cannot just be spammed to increase the style rank. In fact, repeating the same attacks again and again only stops the rank's progression and lowers it. The rank also drops if players get hit. Players can also taunt enemies to increase their style rank, but at the risk of dropping that rank if they get hit. Throughout the course of the game, players will be playing as 3 different characters, each with their own set of abilities to use to kill demons in style. At the beginning of the game, players only get to play as Nero. He serves as an introductory character for players new to the franchise. His melee attacks involve slashing enemies with his sword, Red Queen. The Red Queen has a special gauge known as the Exceed gauge, or EX gauge for short. This gauge is useful in combat as EX attacks become available, but players need to take note of when they have EX meter because at least 1 bar of meter is used up whenever an attack is performed. There are 2 ways of acquiring EX meter. The first method is by pressing the EX button. It's useful when exploring a level, but is inconvenient during combat. The second method is performing a technique known as Exact, where players have to press the EX button right after performing an attack. A huge advantage is that when Exact is done properly, players gain 1 bar of EX meter, opening opportunities to immediately follow up combos with EX techniques. Nero's ranged attack has him shooting demons with his gun, the Blue Rose. Nero has a new color-up ability that allows him to load the Blue Rose with 3 special rounds that deal increased damage. Previously, Nero could only charge his gun to deal more damage. The charge shot is still available, but only as an upgrade, and was significantly reduced in its capabilities. This means the color-up ability was added to compensate for the reduced damage of charge shot. The final weapon that Nero has in his arsenal is the Devil Breaker. Previously, the Devil Bringer would allow him to grab enemies and do special grab attacks to them. While it was a useful technique, his kit wound up becoming limited since he didn't get any new weapons and his bringer only had few uses. Thankfully, this problem was solved with the replacement of Devil Breakers. These are prosthetic arms that can be used to inflict pain on enemies. Aside from basic attacks, the breakers can also be charged for a super attack, but the breaker gets destroyed when the super attack is performed. Breakers are fragile, so players are allowed to equip 3 breakers in a loadout by default, and can upgrade the loadout size to have up to 8 breakers in a loadout. Breakers can be destroyed if the player is hit while using a breaker, requiring players to be aware of the appropriate times to use them. It is also possible to make a breaker explode without charging them for a super attack or being hit by using the breakaway move. This move prevents a player from getting hit by an attack at the cost of the breaker that was equipped. Thankfully, breakers are scattered throughout missions and can be picked up and equipped immediately. Breakers picked up are set as the current breaker in a loadout, requiring players to determine whether or not they need the breaker. It becomes especially important to manage a loadout since breakers are placed randomly throughout levels. That said, he will always have access to Wire Snatch, regardless of whether or not Nero has Devil Breakers. This allows him to grab enemies and bring them closer to him when a player locks onto them and presses the breaker button. This makes Nero a great entry character to the franchise, as players have means of extending their combos until they unlock and learn multiple ways of moving closer to enemies while doing combos. As great as the Devil Breaker system is, there is still one flaw to it. There is no way for players to cycle between the breakers without destroying them. Taking into account that breakers break when the player is hit while they're being used, it doesn't allow players to fully explore the capabilities of the Devil Breakers while on a mission. This often causes players to use a loadout with 4 types of a breaker at most to guarantee that players will always have breakers they know how to use. Having the ability to switch breakers mid-combat would also greatly increase the combo potential of players as they keep on playing. Players start off with 2 types of Devil Breakers, but have access to 6 more breakers as they progress through the game. At the beginning of the game, players are only allowed to equip 3 breakers at a time, but can eventually equip 8 breakers once they upgrade their loadout limit. With the Digital Deluxe Edition, players have access to 4 more breakers. The first of the breakers to be discussed will be the ones available in the base game. Overture is the first one available. At first, this seems like a simple weapon, but it has a unique trait of tracking enemies to an extent. If an enemy is above the player when the Overture is used, then Nero will use it to do an uppercut. If the enemy is below, then a smashing attack will be performed that will cause a ground bounce on those hit. When timed properly, the Overture can deflect attacks, but timing is quite strict since it can be broken. When fully charged, Nero thrusts the breaker into an enemy, and the breaker can explode after either the timer runs out or is shot at. The applications are quite subtle, but when fully understood, this breaker becomes one of Nero's most powerful weapons. Gerbera is available after clearing Mission 1. Gerbera's basic attacks may look similar to Overture, but when tilting the left analog stick while using the breaker, Nero can propel himself to that direction. The applications are quite expansive for an item that is unlocked early in the game. Common examples involve evading enemy attacks, extending air combos, and launching demons into the air. Gerbera's super attack is dependent on whether Nero is on the ground or on the air. If on the ground, Nero shoots out a huge laser that can be manipulated with a left analog stick. It can deal a lot of damage and greatly increase a player's style rank, but Nero can't move during this attack, making him vulnerable to counterattacks if reckless. When in the air, Nero shoots out the laser that splits up to hit multiple targets. While this deals less damage, the air variant is useful for crowd control, and players recover quickly after the attack is performed. With this much utility, there's a reason why this often ends up being used in a loadout. Punchline is unlocked after clearing Mission 2. Punchline's basic attack has Nero throwing out the arm to find a target and fly around that target, dealing damage while it's out. Punchline eventually returns to the player after time, but it can be called back manually by pressing the breaker button. If the breaker button is held while Punchline is out, Nero rides on it like a skateboard. While riding the weapon, Nero can perform different attacks depending on the button used. Players can't ride on the board for long because it can explode if the player doesn't get off of it. When players jump off Punchline, the timer is reset and players can ride it again. Fully charging Punchline makes Nero do a powerful punch with it. If he's on the ground, he does an uppercut. If he's in the air, he punches downward. It's a great breaker to get players doing combos since players can still fight while the breaker is out. The riding function is also useful for crowd control since riding attacks have wide hitboxes. Helter Skelter also becomes available after clearing Mission 2. This one is the simpler breaker in the game. Its basic attack involves hitting a target with a rotating blade. This can be extended repeatedly by pressing the breaker button. The super attack involves Nero doing a powerful drill attack, and is particularly useful in breaking enemy armor. The Buster Arm is also unlocked after clearing Mission 3. This serves as Nero's Devilbringer in the previous game, giving him the ability to grab enemies and perform special attacks that vary depending on the enemy. Just like in 4, it's possible to be hit out of a grab by other enemies, cancelling your grab and breaking Buster Arm in the process. The fully charged grab can only be done once, but deals a huge amount of damage in the process, providing opportunities to kill foes in one combo. The super grab even has armor, preventing your style rank to be decreased when hit, as well as not cancelling the grab. Ragtime appears after clearing Mission 5. Using its basic move throws out a bubble that slows down time inside it, making it easier to evade and parry enemies since Nero is unaffected by the bubble. Fully charging Ragtime temporarily freezes time, letting players do any combo they want since enemies are vulnerable. Rawhide is usable after clearing Mission 6. Players can do multi-hitting area of effect attacks by repeatedly pressing the breaker button, but if they delay the attack, they can do an attack that affects a smaller area but do more hits in a combo. Rawhide also extends the reach of the Wire Snatch ability, and is indicated when Nero uses Rawhide to grab enemies rather than the standard zipline used to bring enemies closer. Its super attack makes players grab the nearest enemy and spin them around before slamming them to the ground. Enemies crash close to Nero, allowing players to follow up with a combo. Tomboy is another breaker obtained after clearing Mission 6. Using this breaker boosts Nero's weapons, replacing the Red Queen's repertoire with highly explosive moves, as well as completely changing how ranged attacks work. While Tomboy is active, Nero can change to a shooting stance by pressing the ranged attack. Succeeding shots become much stronger while in this stance, though this sacrifices the ability for players to charge their shots while performing combos. One neat thing about Tomboy is that activating it counts as a hit, allowing players to stun enemies and even parry attacks. Players should be careful when trying to parry though, since the hitbox is only in front of Nero, and the animation doesn't last long. Activating this removes the ability to lock on to targets, but the lock on button can still be held so that different attacks can be performed. This does become a hindrance in combat, since making the attacks connect is not as easy to do, since players have to adjust where they're hitting with the left analog stick. Overall, this breaker is not recommended for the faint of heart. By purchasing the Deluxe Edition, players have access to 4 more breakers after clearing Mission 1. That said, half of them are not as good as the ones unlocked in-game, and they're not needed to play the game properly. In fact, half of them end up becoming a hindrance since they have a chance of appearing throughout levels. Aside from the design change, this is a more streamlined version of the Gerbera. By just pressing the breaker attack, it automatically launches players into the air, while pressing the breaker attack mid-air brings players back to the ground. Not much needs to be said about the super attack since it's the same as the regular Gerbera. Pasta Breaker is also available with the Deluxe Edition. Its basic attack involves throwing it out at an enemy and making it deal damage to them until the timer ends. Once it's done, it returns to the player. One thing to note though is that this breaker affects a player's loadout by placing the breaker that's supposed to succeed the Pasta Breaker to the last slot. The super attack has Nero inserting the Pasta Breaker into an enemy, causing it to deal more damage over time before finally exploding. What makes the super attack interesting is that this doesn't change the loadout compared to its basic attack, letting players think ways of getting specific breakers and switching to them. Sweet Surrender is a breaker based on sexual innuendo. Activating this breaker regenerates Nero's health over time. When fully charged, Sweet Surrender breaks, restoring a portion of Nero's health immediately. This breaker is best used when reaching phone booths or divinity statues to recover health, but the use of this breaker is very specific due to green orbs being available up to SOS difficulty. The Mega Buster pays homage to Mega Man, Capcom's other popular franchise. This not only gives players the Buster Shot with its basic attack, but also changes Nero's jump, dodge, and death animations to imitate Mega Man. And just like Mega Man, the Buster Shot is only limited to horizontal directions. The way shots are fired can't be changed at all, and it doesn't help that players can't target enemies since that causes the wire snatch. Its super attack is the charged Buster Shot, but even then, the Buster becomes a gimmick more than anything else since this is hard to use, and doesn't offer much utility compared to the alternatives available. The breaker system gives Nero the depth that he lacked in Devil May Cry 4. It's possible to stop talking about Nero at this point since the Exceed, Color Up, and Devil Breaker mechanics show that he's a beginner-friendly character that provides a great amount of depth to those who wish to experiment and improve. However, there's more to discuss as his repertoire opens up greatly when completing the game. In the final mission, Nero regains his Devil Bringer and obtains a new Devil Trigger form. After defeating Virgil, there's an additional scenario in the game that has you playing as Nero with both the Devil Bringer and Devil Breaker available. After playing this section, players will unlock the ability to have both the Devil Bringer and the Devil Breaker, expanding Nero's toolkit greatly. The Devil Bringer lets players perform grabs again, akin to Devil May Cry 4. The damage that the grabs can do is generally weaker than the Buster Arm, but this is compensated by the fact that players don't have to bring Buster Arms with them, and only need them when facing powerful foes such as Furies or Scudo Angelos. Just like the Buster Arm, players can still be hit while grabbing, so players must find ways to use this while being safe. The Devil Bringer also gives Nero a new ability, the Bringer Knuckle. Players can immediately press the Bringer button after performing an attack. This not only adds damage, but also stuns enemies in place, allowing players to follow up knockback moves like Streak with High Roller. It is even possible to do X-Act while performing Bringer Knuckle, making it easier to connect EX attacks for more damage and stylish combos. It's very important to understand that this can be done after any attack, especially those of Red Queen and his Devil Breakers. This means that multi-hitting attacks such as EX moves or Rawhide can have their damage increased by throwing out a Bringer Knuckle after each hit. It's even possible to perform the Bringer Knuckle while riding on Punchline. The Bringer Knuckle can also be used in retaliation to an enemy attack, stopping enemies in their tracks. Nero's Devil Trigger, The second ability he unlocks is completely different from his previous Devil Trigger. Rather than having a demonic specter forming behind him and copy his attacks, he transforms into a demon, which greatly increases his damage output, provides super armor so that he doesn't get phased by attacks, and regenerates health over time. This also allows Nero to do super versions of his grabs, dealing increased damage as a result. The only problem with this version is that this deals less damage than the Buster Arm Breaker. It's only fair though, since players always have access to the grabs and can replace the Buster Arm with other breakers. Overall, these two abilities alone provide even more depth, and are great rewards for completing the game, especially since they are useful for clearing missions in higher difficulties as Nero. The next character players get to control is V. He's often the more methodical character, as he often relies on his familiars to fight demons. Most of the time, V summons two familiars. Shadow is a panther-like familiar that can shapeshift into blades and spikes, essentially becoming V's melee attack. Griffin is V's ranged attack. Griffin flies around and shoots lightning, but if the ranged attack is charged, his moves end up dealing more damage and increase the style rank by a huge amount. The best strategies often involve charging Griffin's attack while attacking with Shadow. The familiars can't kill demons, but they can eventually put enemies in a stunned state that makes them pale. In this state, V can approach enemies and kill them. The stun is only temporary though, and if they aren't killed before the timer runs out, stunned enemies regain a portion of their health and continue fighting. By killing enemies, V gains 1 bar of Devil Trigger. Be warned though that V is still vulnerable when killing enemies, meaning these kills must be done when enemies are either far away or distracted by the familiars. An interesting thing about V's killing blow is that it can be used to parry attacks, meaning V has some form of defense, albeit limited. V is not as physically mobile compared to other playable characters, and is also bad at defending himself. The only time he can actually defend himself is when he parries an attack with his cane by performing his killing blow just as an enemy is about to attack him, and even that has strict timing. When he needs a dodge, he has to recall his familiars to get him out of danger. While he's evading, he can't attack with the familiar he recalled. This even applies to double jumps as V recalls Griffin to carry the former, making positioning even more crucial. V's familiars have life bars of their own. When depleted, a familiar transforms into its insignia and enters a state of stalemate. In this state, the familiar needs a certain amount of time to recover before fighting again. Stalemated familiars can recover faster if V is closer to them. This serves as a great reward for players risking their lives for their familiars. The stalemate system also serves as a warning for players to not be so reckless when laying the offensive with Griffin and Shadow, as stalemate greatly limits V's capabilities. The Devil Trigger that V acquires can be used in two ways. By consuming 1 bar of Devil Trigger, V can strengthen Griffin and Shadow. By pressing their corresponding buttons, they'll do random attacks that are available to them. What makes these power-ups interesting is that it's still possible to do special attacks as usual, providing control as to how players want to use these power-ups. The power-up doesn't last long, and more bars need to be consumed for the effect to last longer. V can also summon Nightmare, a powerful golem that performs random attacks, but needs at least 3 Devil Trigger bars to be summoned. Summoning Nightmare revives stalemated familiars and fully replenishes their health, which is useful for situations where there are too many enemies to deal with. The length of which Nightmare can stay to fight is dependent on the amount of Devil Trigger remaining. An upgrade can be spent to extend the period of time it can fight, but caution should still be taken into consideration, especially when wanting to enhance Griffin and Shadow's damage output. V can actually ride on Nightmare's back and control what attacks Nightmare performs. Players will have to immediately jump off Nightmare if they wish to kill enemies, encouraging players to be more skillful when summoning Nightmare. V is invulnerable, but a bar of Devil Trigger is lost every time Nightmare is hit while the former is riding behind, reducing the amount of time that Nightmare can fight. While in combat, V can read his book of poetry. He slowly gains a bar of Devil Trigger when reciting a full verse. He also moves a lot slower, meaning that this should be only done when V is not being chased by enemies. The best way to safely read is by attacking enemies with familiars, but even that requires some caution. V also can't read while jumping or evading attacks, amplifying the importance of keeping a distance from demons lest this reading is disrupted. V can still read while Nightmare is out, but Devil Trigger isn't gained, ensuring that Nightmare can't keep fighting indefinitely. Later on in the game, players can unlock a move that can kill all executable enemies in an area. This move consumes Devil Trigger, and the amount of bars consumed is dependent on the number of killable enemies detected. It's an efficient way of thinning down packs, but using this constantly requires a comprehensive understanding of how to effectively use V's tools. While V is certainly a powerful character, he's often misunderstood as a button-mashing character. This mostly has to do with V's levels being easy to clear in lower difficulties, but as players play more, they realize that placement is very crucial with V's gameplay, as V is a lot more fragile than other characters. It doesn't particularly help that enemies deal increased damage in higher difficulties. Dante is the last playable character in the game. He becomes playable around mission 10, but he makes up for it by having 8 missions to clear, giving players enough time to understand his kit. Aside from the basic melee and ranged attacks, he also has access to 4 styles. He can only use one per instance, but he can switch from one style to another by using the directional pad, allowing players to do flashy combos with them by pressing the style button. Swordmaster lets Dante perform stylish attacks with his melee weapons, also known as his devil arms. It's especially a great way for players to extend their combos when playing with select devil arms, but often requires good dodging or parrying to maintain the style rank. Techniques available will be explained later on, as the moves available to this style are arm-specific. Royal Guard turns great defense into a powerful offense. By pressing the style button, Dante can deflect attacks and absorb them as energy for the Royal Guard meter. Players can maintain the block stance by holding the style button at the cost of losing a Devil Trigger bar every time they're hit. Players hit while maintaining this stance without Devil Trigger are stunned from Guard Break, making them vulnerable to counterattacks. Skillful players can block attacks without Devil Trigger by blocking just as an enemy attacks. By doing so, a bar of Devil Trigger is gained, as well as even more Royal Guard meter. At the start, Dante is only capable of blocking while on the ground, but upgrading Royal Guard eventually enables blocking mid-air. The Royal Guard meter has special uses when built up. For starters, Dante can use his entire Royal Guard meter to deal damage in one strike with his release move. If this move is used just as an enemy attacks, players are rewarded with more damage and even launch attackers into the air. Just like blocking, release can eventually be performed mid-air after upgrading Royal Guard. One last use of the Royal Guard meter is through a technique called Royal Revenge. With his move, Dante prepares himself in a parrying stance, deflecting moves and immediately retaliating. Each move he deflects consumes 1 bar of Royal Guard meter, and players trying to perform this move without any meter are punished with a Guard Break, similar to blocking. It's safe to say that Royal Guard is a particularly powerful style, especially considering the harder difficulties that make set pieces much more engaging with more enemy types and increased enemy health and damage. Gunslinger is the ranged equivalent of Swordmaster, allowing players to perform techniques not normally accessible with their gun's repertoire. Unlike Swordmaster, defense isn't necessarily required provided players can maintain their distance from enemies. Techniques available will also be explained later on as they're gun specific. Trickster allows players great mobility for a variety of uses. Players pressing the style button while moving in a certain direction will quickly move towards that path while being invulnerable in that instance. The nice thing about this technique is that this can also be performed mid-air, allowing players to evade safely when necessary. It's even possible to move towards an enemy and run up on them if approached from the ground or run down on them if approached mid-air. It's a move players should consider often since the recovery is quick and opens up even more combo possibilities, provided that the style is upgraded. Another interesting thing that can be performed with Trickster is teleporting to enemies. Dante can eventually teleport either in front of an enemy mid-air or on the ground. The commands to perform these are specific, but they offer a lot of combo potential. Dante can even recover when knocked back by an enemy attack, allowing players to fight offensively immediately. Dante starts off with 2 devil arms and 2 guns, eventually gaining access to 4 weapons for each type. After beating the game in Sons of Sparta mode, Dante unlocks a new upgrade known as Irregular Full Custom. Once purchased, players can equip all the weapons Dante unlocks, and even remove equipment he uses in the default loadout. Dante starts off with the Rebellion, his signature sword given to him by his father, Sparta. Its attacks are rather basic and limited, especially since the Rebellion only has 2 basic combos compared to the Red Queen's 4 basic combos. While Dante can launch up in the air to follow his opponents by holding the melee button while doing high time, the only air attack this weapon has is the Helmbreaker, which causes him to slam the ground with Rebellion. If players want to do fancy combos with just this weapon alone while not using Swordmaster, then their best bet would be to just launch enemies into the air and juggle them with ground combos. This is where Swordmaster comes in, as it adds in moves that Rebellion wouldn't be able to use otherwise, giving the weapon a basic air combo, an additional launcher move, and even the ability to throw Rebellion at foes and deal damage to them over a set time. Later on, he acquires the Devil Sword Sparta, and uses that over Rebellion in the next mission he's on. While the moveset is similar to that of Rebellion's, it should be noted that this actually deals more damage than the Rebellion, is much faster, and has greater reach, making this weapon a nice reward for pushing through Mission 10. Once Dante discovers Rebellion's hidden power, he uses it to combine his power with the Devil Sword Sparta to create the Devil Sword Dante. This sword is actually weaker than the Devil Sword Sparta in terms of damage output, but makes up for it with utility. For starters, Devil Sword Dante has an additional basic combo, which ends its string with a Prop and Shredder sequence when the third attack is delayed, giving players more ways to juggle their foes. In addition to that, the air combo that was normally accessible when using Swordmaster for the previous two swords is now part of DSD's kit, which is a great improvement over the two swords since it means that DSD has great combo potential, especially when combined with Enemy Step to keep enemies in the air for a long time. A special ability that DSD has is summoning flying swords to fight alongside Dante. These floating swords can be used in several ways. For example, holding the melee button and releasing it when DSD glows will summon the swords at the cost of 2 Devil Trigger bars. The use of these summoned swords will vary depending on the style currently used, regardless if DSD is currently equipped or not. Using Swordmaster, for example, causes the swords to follow up a player's attack. The attacks done by these swords will vary depending on the weapon used, but these swords will increase the damage output of attacks in general. If Gunslinger is being used, the swords will automatically attack enemies close to Dante, making this an interesting way to extend combos. If these swords are out while Trickster is in use, then it will allow players to dash and jump twice. When Royal Guard is being used while the swords are out, they protect the player by decreasing the amount of damage dealt by enemies. These swords can also be summoned by activating Devil Trigger mode as long as DSD is in a player's loadout. These floating swords are also used in DSD's Swordmaster repertoire. The swords do almost all the attacks that Dante can do, ranging from basic attacks to special moves like Stinger and High Roller. Round Trip and Danse Macabre are abilities that are available to Rebellion and Sparta. DSD also has these moves, but their inputs are changed due to the addition of High Roller and Stingers. Overall, DSD is a great weapon that offers a lot of utility and combo potential. It's so good that it's even possible to get SSS rank combos using just this weapon. Another devil arm that Dante has is Balrog. These are Dante's gauntlets that allow Dante to fight hand to hand. What makes Balrog stand out from gauntlets that Dante used over the years is how it separates kicks in kick mode and punches in blow mode rather than having them mixed in a basic combo string. By separating punches and kicks, attacks become mechanically distinct with Balrog. Punches are quick attacks that don't deal a lot of damage alone, while kicks are powerful attacks that are slow. As shown, each stance has their own strengths and weaknesses, but these stances can be switched by targeting an enemy and tilting the joystick back while pressing the melee button, giving the weapon great combo potential. A mechanic exclusive to this weapon is Ignition. This can be activated by either hitting enemies with a total of 10 punches while in blow mode or holding the melee button while in kick mode. Once ignited, this increases the range and damage of Balrog's attacks and enables the use of moves exclusive to this mode while using the Swordmaster style. One thing interesting about the Swordmaster moves of these stances is that they contrast to the basic kit of these stances. Blow mode, for example, has slow, powerful charging attacks, while kick mode has faster attacks. What this essentially means is that it's possible to do high-ranking combos with just this weapon and just with one stance. Cavalier is a motorcycle devil arm that Dante acquires early on in his journey. The weapon is slow, but one attack alone can do multiple hits, and offers hyper armor to prevent Dante from being knocked back during the active frames of these attacks. Some of these attacks, though, are difficult to pull off in actual scenarios due to the slow startup they have, making Dante easy pickings if players aren't careful. These attacks also have long animations and require commitment from the player to get maximum damage. The Swordmaster attacks have Dante fighting enemies by riding the Cavalier, doing techniques like spinning in circles while riding, doing wheelies, and even launching enemies high into the air. The weapon can be often difficult to use in the beginning, but it's definitely useful early game given its wide hitboxes, allowing to take on multiple foes at once. With the Digital Deluxe Edition, Dante also has access to the Cavalier R the moment the normal weapon is unlocked in-game. Aside from a new look, this version doesn't have the hyper armor the normal version has. While this version does have a unique move to use, it's not recommended for anyone trying to learn the Devil Arm. While the Cavalier is one of the more gimmicky weapons in the game, it has a couple of mechanics that make this weapon highly useful in combat. The gear shift mechanic, for example, increases the speed and damage output of follow-up attacks depending on when the follow-up attack is performed, making use of the Cavalier's hyper armor properties. While this may come off as intimidating, it's actually easy to know the appropriate time to do the next attack. The trick is to perform the next attack when Cavalier glows purple. Cavalier only has a total of 4 basic combos, where the regular move kit has 1 ground and air combo, while the Swordmaster set also has 1 ground and air combo. To make up for the lack of combos this weapon has, it is actually possible to mix the sequence of these combos by varying the follow-ups between the melee attacks and the Swordmaster attacks. For example, Cavalier has a basic combo that consists of pressing the melee button thrice, but if the melee, style, and melee sequence was done while in Swordmaster, then the second sequence of the basic Swordmaster combo is performed rather than the second sequence of the basic melee combo. This is especially useful when in the air, as the basic air combo for Cavalier only uses the melee button twice. This means that the mid-air melee and style sequence causes a loop that Dante can maintain long enough to kill enemies while out of harm's way with the height Cavalier's launcher provides. With the proper positioning, it even becomes possible to launch multiple enemies into the air and kill them all with 1 air combo. The last of Dante's Devil Arms is King Cerberus. At first glance, these nunchucks look similar to the Cerberus nunchucks unlocked in Devil May Cry 3. But there's one huge mechanical difference between these weapons. King Cerberus has access to 3 elements instead of just 1: ice, fire, and lightning. The ice element is used as basic melee attacks. Majority of Cerberus' moves that were exclusive to Swordmaster now became King Cerberus' special moves, giving Dante access to useful moves such as Ice Age, a move that showers Dante with ice, hitting anything surrounding him, as well as Crystal, a move that summons ice in a line in front of him. Just like Cerberus, each attack does 2 hits. It may not seem like much, but it becomes relevant information since this weapon has a delayable combo that is useful for crowd control while dealing significant damage to enemies in front of the player. While King Cerberus doesn't have any air combos, its air attack is useful in maintaining height, making it possible to do air combos with a lot of air time to kill enemies easily. The fire element is exclusive to King Cerberus' Swordmaster kit, transforming the Devil Arm into a bow staff. Attacks with the staff are fast and deal a good amount of damage while having decent crowd control. One problem with this weapon is that the only air attack this element has is a move that causes Dante to go down to the ground, making the air attack only useful if players need to go back to the ground to relaunch or launch new enemies into the air. The lightning element can be used by holding either the melee button or the style button in Swordmaster until electricity sparks from the Devil Arm. This provides a great amount of reach, but planning and strategy is required to use this due to the nature of the attacks being different depending on what button is being held. Ultimately, a common trend between these Devil Arms is that they're designed in a way that they can be used by themselves to do amazing combos, and open up even more amazing combos when switching weapons. What this means is that Dante is an accessible character with the most depth in the game, and the guns available can help add even more depth to his gameplay, although most of the guns themselves are quite limited unlike the Devil Arms. Ebony and Ivory are Dante's signature pistols. While these pistols are fast, they don't deal a lot of damage, and they're often only used to maintain the style rank. Holding the ranged attack charges Dante's pistols, temporarily increasing their damage. When using the Gunslinger, Dante's pistols are automatically charged and powered up, but separates the pistols by having the left pistol assigned to the range button while the right pistol is assigned to the style button. What this does is allow the pistols to fire in separate directions, but it's not as useful for crowd control since they don't deal a lot of damage. Mid-air, using the style button unleashes Rainstorm, a move that causes Dante to rapidly fire Ebony and Ivory while facing the ground and spinning. This is the only move that allows interesting combos to be done with the pistols. The sawed-off shotgun is the second gun Dante has. Like Ebony and Ivory, the shotgun can also be charged, but only to fire a shot with increased damage. This gun is one of the harder guns to use in combos because of its ability to constantly knock back enemies. With constant knockback, it can easily become frustrating to continue combos with this weapon, requiring the use of movement abilities like Stinger or Trickster, which segues into the shotgun's gunslinger techniques. Neutral style button, either on the ground or mid-air, causes Dante to fire the shotgun around him, which is decent for crowd control. That said, the meat of the shotgun's gunslinger moveset is in the shotgun stinger. Aside from the fact that this is basically Dante's stinger but performed with a shotgun, this move can be cancelled during its active frames into follow-ups that have players rolling or sliding around and shooting a target. What makes this especially useful is that these follow-ups can be used repeatedly, allowing players to have fun if they know what they're doing. Dr. Faust is unlocked at the beginning of Mission 13, and is the most powerful ranged weapon in the game. This hat uses red orbs as ammo, increasing the amount spent to deal more damage. However, with either a Mad Hat or a Set Hat, players can make enemies wear the same hat to make those enemies drop even more red orbs while hit. Faust is amazing to use in combos due to two moves: Hat Trick and the Man in the Red. Hat Trick causes enemies affected by Mad Hatter and Set Hat to explode and land in front of Dante, allowing him to follow up with deadly combos. Man in the Red summons orbs that orbit around Dante and deal damage to enemies close by at the cost of red orbs, though this is a small cost as hat-wearing enemies drop even more red orbs than usual. It's a high-risk weapon though because players hit by hat-wearing enemies will lose a lot of red orbs as punishment, requiring even more finesse out of the player. Faust's gunslinger moves aren't much, but it has access to one of the most powerful moves in the game, Red Hot Night. By spending from 50,000 red orbs to 150,000 red orbs, meteors are summoned from the sky to kill anything caught by them. The move itself requires some setup, but when done properly, this move alone can kill bosses. The Kalina Ann 2 is a new model to replace the original version Lady lost after fighting Urizen, and is also the last gun Dante acquires. It's a weapon that deals decent damage, but has high recovery and a limited moveset. With the Gunslinger, the Kalina Ann 2 can fire multiple rockets on either a single enemy or a multitude of them. By pressing the style button mid-air, Dante fires a rocket below his enemies, launching them in the air for air combos. With Enemy Step, it is even possible to jump on enemies after they were launched to either do the move again or cover more height. While the Kalina Ann 2 is unlocked by playing the game's campaign for the first time, it is actually possible to find the original Kalina Ann in Mission 11, even before getting Kalina Ann 2. The moveset of the two rocket launchers are exactly the same, but there's a reason why players should get the two as soon as possible. If players ever find themselves at a point where they acquire one Kalina Ann while wielding another, they automatically gain access to the double Kalina Ann. The double Kalina Ann setup is the better rocket launcher variation to use, despite having its own setbacks. The double's basic attack involves alternating between firing the Kalina Anns, meaning that each attack deals the same amount of damage as having a single Kalina Ann. Holding the ranged attack though makes Dante combine the launchers to fire a laser, dealing even more damage and launching enemies into the air. The majority of the gunslinger moves involve firing even more rockets than a single Kalina Ann. The double Kalina Ann also has a special move that fires a larger, longer-lasting laser, but it's difficult to aim and is often only best done when bosses are open to this attack. The rocket launchers are ultimately the second most useful guns in the game, but often require some setup in order to be used effectively. Dante can also become stronger by using his Devil Trigger form, provided he has at least 3 bars of Devil Trigger. Dante's attacks become much stronger, but some of his special moves consume a bar of Devil Trigger, requiring players to use their moves sparingly. Dante can also regenerate health while in this mode, making it useful to last longer to take down powerful enemies. After absorbing the Sparta by stabbing himself with the Rebellion, Dante acquires the Sin Devil Trigger form along with the Devil Sword Dante. The melee attacks available in this form are only limited to using the Dante Sword. As a matter of fact, Dante can't use any weapons in this form other than the Devil Sword Dante. His ranged attacks involve shooting meteors at enemies. Other attacks available in this form involve shooting multiple lasers from his wings, forming a black hole to hit multiple enemies at once, and even flying mid-air. One unique tool that is available to Sin Devil Trigger is the Quadruple S ability. While this ability has a strict requirement of needing SSS rank, it provides the ability to use Sin Devil Trigger attacks while switching in and out of the form quickly. The only drawback to Sin Devil Trigger is the absence of health regeneration, but it's rarely an issue considering the abilities this form offers. All these mechanics show how flexible Dante is, being able to switch to a multitude of weapons as well as a multitude of styles to perform a great amount of combos on enemies. Dante had this flexibility since DMC4, but there are two main differences between the learning curve of his DMC4 variation and his DMC5 variation. Dante's tools in DMC4 puts players in a situation where they have to switch styles in order to improve. With DMC5 Dante, players have the option of only focusing on one style and doing well with it, and further using multiple styles if they wish. Another issue with DMC4 is that the enemies weren't designed around playing as Dante compared to DMC5, as they were designed around Nero. Speaking of enemies in DMC5 are diverse, challenging players in different ways, regardless of the character being played. While a good number of enemies debut in Devil May Cry 5, some enemies are either inspired by enemies in previous games or have appeared in previous games, such as the Death Scissors and Nobodies that previously appeared in the original Devil May Cry game. While enemies are tough, they're still killable. If players take time to study their enemies, players learn that enemies have specific weaknesses that can be taken advantage of, rewarding efficiency as a result. Most of these weaknesses can be exploited by parrying, which is done by attacking an enemy just as they are attacking. Other exploits are done by attacking at a distance, or keeping enemies airborne at all times. Again, they're not required tactics to kill enemies, but these tactics reward efficiency for those who take the time to learn them. It shows how much effort was put into enemy mechanics when they're designed in a way that makes them manageable for all characters. Bosses are also unique through the engagement required in facing them, and that's despite the game having 7 instances of repeating boss battles. Even when having to fight the bosses that were already fought, they still become a unique experience due to the addition of attacks and change of pace. Some bosses are only designed to be fighting against one character, such as Nidhogg only being a good fight against V, while Leviathan is designed to only be fought against Nero. Other bosses, however, are designed in a way that they can be beaten by any character of a player's choosing, which shows in the game's Bloody Palace. The Bloody Palace is a mode present in the Devil May Cry franchise since the second game. In Devil May Cry 2 and 3 Special Edition, Bloody Palace had 9,999 levels, but players could choose how many levels they want to skip at the cost of getting weaker or no rewards at all, and waves have randomized enemy sets. In Devil May Cry 4, there are only 101 levels, but players can only advance one level at a time. Another huge change that DMC4's Bloody Palace brought was that enemy placement in waves is constant, allowing players to plan ahead for different characters. While Bloody Palace didn't come with DMC5 on launch, it was added as a free update on the start of April. Once the game was cleared for the first time, players can access this mode with any character of their choice, and fight waves of monsters and bosses until wave 101, similar to DMC4. Every 10 waves, players are rewarded with a certain amount of red orbs that increase depending on how much time they have left. If a player dies or runs out of time, the run ends abruptly. Every 20 waves, players will be fighting a boss, and after clearing 20 waves, the difficulty increases from human up to the hardest difficulty, Dante Must Die. Playing Bloody Palace is great not only because of the red orbs that can be farmed, but also because of the special taunts that are unlocked for clearing the Bloody Palace. V, for example, can unlock a taunt that increases the damage of his attacks and even allows him to hurt enemies with his cane. The enemies in a wave are always constant, giving players opportunity to learn how to clear waves and deal with specific enemies as certain characters. Unlike most Bloody Palace modes, the game mode in this iteration allows players to take breaks from their session and continue after the wave that they cleared. There's a cost to suspending a session though, as players are unable to enter the void while a Bloody Palace session is active, lest they erase the progress made in that run. A warm-up feature is also available for players to clear specific waves without going through an entire run. An interesting thing about this mode is that this can be used to improve the time score for a specific wave, replacing the score of that wave if the run in the warm-up session was better. The best part about the warm-ups is that they show what enemies are in a wave that they cleared, making it useful for players to determine what tactics to use. Overall, the gameplay offers a ton of replayability, and the tools available to players make replaying levels engaging as the skills available enable a variety of stylish gameplay. And now that the gameplay has been discussed, it's time to move on to the microtransactions. While pay-to-win microtransactions have been discussed in other reviews, it can't be stressed enough that they're essentially superfluous. For example, the game provides more than enough red orbs for players to purchase moves, items, and upgrades. As a matter of fact, a majority of these moves and upgrades can be acquired by finishing the game for the first time, and even just going through an early section of a second playthrough offers players more than enough currency to unlock all the essentials of a character's kit. And while a single EX provocation costs 3 million red orbs, and the EX provocations for all characters can be purchased for $7, they're still not worth purchasing with real money because these taunts are not needed. In the case of gold orbs, not only can these items be found once in levels, but the cameo system ends up offering more than enough gold orbs for players to clear the game at least once per difficulty. If players want to get to S rank in all missions on all difficulties, then they should avoid using gold orbs at all times, since using one reduces the overall score by 10%. In fact, players should at least avoid dying so that they can get the no continue bonus to increase their overall score by 20%, making gold orbs useless in the long run. And while the online store also sells blue orbs and purple orbs, the game offers all the orbs needed to upgrade the health and devil trigger gauge to the maximum amount, provided that players explore more of the levels. If players are having trouble looking for these orbs, then they can always just look up online guides and videos on how to find them. The super costumes are also available on the online store, but they can also be acquired by completing the game on DMD. And while they regenerate Devil Trigger over time, using the super costume reduces the total score of a mission by 80%, meaning it's almost impossible to get S ranks while having these costumes on, making them useless to use in the long run. This shows that these microtransactions weren't prioritized, proving that they were confident that this game would make a lot of money not because of microtransactions, but because of the quality of the game's craft. It's an attitude that hasn't been as prevalent in the current AAA gaming industry compared to the indie and AA gaming industry, but an essential attitude nonetheless to inspire developers to improve on their craft. Meanwhile, there is downloadable content worth purchasing. For example, it is possible to purchase pre-development versions of the in-game cutscenes and use those instead. While not often recommended to use when playing as it disrupts the visual consistency, they can be entertaining to watch as an action B-movie when watching them in the gallery. Watching these scenes is also inspiring to an extent, as these cutscenes provide the footwork for the final product. The Digital Deluxe bundle includes pre-development cutscenes, battle soundtracks for previous DMC games, random title and style announcer voices, 4 additional breakers, and Cavalier R. While all of these can be purchased separately, the items are priced in a way that if someone were interested in majority of the content, then they'd be better off buying the deluxe bundle. Another worthwhile purchase is the original soundtrack. It's about $15 and has the entire soundtrack in FLAC, MP3, and AAC formats, which is useful when listening on a PC or media player at home, or on a phone when on the go. As mentioned, the soundtrack is also available on Spotify, and the quality available is just as good for those on Spotify Premium. The online store also sells the extra costumes that came with a pre-order bonus for Devil May Cry 5, and while they're not bad designs, they're often not worth it for PC owners since there are different mods that they can use for free. To conclude this section, the pay-to-win microtransactions are not worth buying, and not even needed to progress. DLC, on the other hand, provides neat extra content for anyone interested. And with the microtransactions and DLC out of the way, it's now possible to form a conclusion regarding the game's quality. This game does a lot of things well. The game looks gorgeous even though half of the levels look repetitive, the game's soundtrack is absolutely stellar, and the dynamic music brings out the energy to sell the combat. The story is surprisingly solid and subtle with its themes. The pay-to-win microtransactions do not affect the gameplay at all, considering how generous the game is with currency and resources. And last but not least, the combat is both accessible and in-depth. There's a low barrier of entry, but the tools available for all the characters create a high skill ceiling that is worth reaching to perform fancy combos against challenging enemies. This game is worth a full price with the content available, and the bonus DLC can provide additional sources of entertainment and amusement. It's nice to see Capcom providing good games, and hopefully they continue on and improve their performance, especially since that's beneficial to gamers and Capcom in the long run.